In this section, we'll look at the trench warfare that began to develop in the Western Front late 1914 and really was firmly established by 1916. By 1916, it was obvious that the military situation had settled into a bloody stalemate. After an initial Austrian offensive against Serbia in 1914, Germany had launched a plan to go around the French fortress on the Franco-German border and attack through Belgium, the so-called von Schlieffen plan. Initially, the attack went really well, and Germany advanced into northern France during the fall of 1914. Just after the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, when the Allies stopped the Central Powers' advance on Paris, Allied and German troops kept trying to outflank one another. Each time their opponents would block them. The result was soon a long line from the Alps all the way to the English Channel in the north of France. 19th century warfare had always demanded close combat, given the limits of weaponry. Battles were fluid, people moved around a lot, and there were a lot of things like flanking maneuvers. With the Industrial Revolution, however, such 19th century strategies really didn't work anymore. Whereas rifles were accurate for several hundred yards in the middle of the 1800s, by World War I they were accurate close to 1,000 yards. Artillery was much more destructive and more accurate from distant ranges. Barbed wire often slowed movements, as did mines. Machine guns were common now, first developed in the 1880s by Sir Hiram Stevens Maxim, and known as the Maxim gun. By World War I, new improvements made the machine gun more deadly and more accurate. The result of this reality was that strategy simply wasn't up to technology. It was a long line of trenches, which was difficult to break. Trenches had first been employed in the Crimean War in Europe in the 1850s and in the American Civil War in the 1860s. But this long line of trenches from the Alps to the English Channel really surpassed anything before. There was actually several parallel lines of trenches connected with supply trenches. There were underground bunkers and barbed wire in front, and just before the quote mine no man's land. Behind the trenches was heavy artillery. These massive developments were difficult to break with the frontal charges that each side unleashed. Life in the trenches was a real bitch, even if there wasn't fighting. People would carve out holes to sleep, but rain would often make it all muddy. Rats were common and sanitary conditions were nasty. Common infections included dysentery, typhus, and cholera. Many soldiers suffered from parasites and related infections. Fungal infections such as trench mouth and trench foot were common. A common killer was simple exposure, since temperature in the trench during the winter could easily fall well below freezing. Because there really wasn't enough time or space for adequate burial, bodies would often be buried where they fell, and then sometimes later on rising to the surface with the rains. World War I was the first war in which battlefield deaths exceeded those by disease, but literally hundreds of thousands died of diseases near or in the Western Front trenches. Life in the trenches was often tedious and boring. People would play chess, checkers, or cards, or write or read letters. Food was often unhygienic, and the trenches were close enough at times that one could actually hear the enemy. If one stood up, they were invariably exposed to enemy fire. To break the trenches, the army would order frontal assaults, often signaled by a whistle. Each side never knew when an attack was coming, so most of the time they just anxiously waited. First would come a bombardment of the enemy lines, hopefully loosening them up and the very least providing some smoke for cover. The soldiers with their bayonets would go, quote, over the top and run through no man's land. Not an easy thing to do with the ditches, mud, and all the heavy equipment that they carried. All the while they were in a minefield and exposed to enemy machine gun fire. If one lived to make the enemy's lines, hand-to-hand combat often resulted, often when the attacker was outnumbered. In the end, invariably, the attackers would fall back, and the enemy, then sensing a good time to attack, would launch their own assault, with the same ultimate results. Here you see a picture of a battle line just after the attack. Early in the Western Front trench warfare, there were still signs of the old 19th century idea of chivalrous warfare. There were, people used to assume, rules to honorable warfare. One didn't mistreat prisoners or shoot unarmed men. Civilians and women were left out. This concept of war would quickly die out in the Western Front trenches, where the 20th century concept of warfare took hold. All's fair in love and war. Nevertheless, at Christmas 1914, troops on both sides of the trenches could hear one another and began singing Christmas carols. This led to the men from both sides venturing out into no man's land to socialize and even play a game of soccer. On Christmas Day, they didn't fight, resuming their fight the following day. This Christmas Eve, Christmas Day truce was against orders, and later a number of men on both sides faced court-martial. In any event, by 1916 it was clear that the Western Front had become a war of attrition. Neither side, it appeared, was able to break the enemy lines, and the constant and continual assaults just decimated an entire generation of men. The war here wouldn't provide a strategic victory, but whomever had the most men and supplies would probably emerge the victor. This concludes the section on the trench warfare from 1914 to 1916 on the Western Front.